Hi, everyone. Welcome back to episode 3 of Double Spaced, which is a writing podcast hosted by twins, allegedly the only writing podcast hosted by twins, which is just something that your host, Rachel, who hopefully you'll be able to tell our voices apart soon. Anyway, that's just something I've been saying. And of course, I have my lovely co host, my sister, Sarah.
I'm so happy to be back for our next episode.
Yes, and we're excited to have Sarah. And honestly, Sarah's been doing such a really good job on the social media because she put out a poll asking you guys what you wanted to see next or listen to next for Double Space 3. And you voted for a talk on atmosphere. And so she's done a really good job at putting together a lovely little script for what we can expect in today's episode. So, round of applause for Sarah. If you're listening to this on Spotify, give her some love in the comments. And if you're on YouTube, you can also do the same thing because she worked really hard on establishing this episode. So, we're going to get into it. We have a little outline here that Sarah's created to talk about atmosphere. And the first thing that she wanted to talk about is what are our personal definitions of atmosphere? And she can kind of go into her definition.
Yeah, sure. Well, just to begin with, when I put this as an option for the poll, I didn't even quite know what atmosphere even was for me. So, just as a bit of a disclaimer that this is just what, I think and what Rachel thinks. And I just hope at least that it's interesting to listen to. But I was thinking about what atmosphere is to me and in my work. And for me, it's a part of the setting. It's what makes the setting sparkle and what makes the setting memorable because it often engages the senses. And then I also noted that it's the mood your characters move through and this feeling that sort of coats your whole story or scene or paragraph even.
Yeah, I love that phrase that you had written down there, the feeling that coats your whole story. I was like, that's the most Sarah way. Like that
Thank
would
you.
appear in your novel. Like the most Sarah way to
Maybe.
describe atmosphere, feeling that coats your whole story. Oh, that's so perfect. And of course, I didn't have as like literary of a definition.
It's okay.
But I just basically said that atmosphere is the overall tone of your story's environment. I think tone and atmosphere are quite linked and they can kind of lean on each other. And atmosphere can also be established through word choice and specific detail, which we're going to talk about. And in general, it kind of sets the vibe. That's how I would describe like atmosphere to somebody who like isn't a writer. It would just be atmosphere is like the vibe. Like think of
Yeah.
in a horror movie when you hear like the kind of the eerie music, like maybe the wind outside and it feels creepy. That's what atmosphere is, that vibe, the feeling you get from a setting. And
Yeah, that's a good example.
yeah, and setting isn't really something that I talk about that much on my own channel, which if you are just tuning into this on Spotify and have no idea who we are, you can also find this podcast on a YouTube channel called Rachel Writes, where Rachel, who is the one talking right now, makes writing videos. But I don't really talk about setting all that much because I don't feel like I excel at it, which is why it's good to have a setting pro. Now, I don't want to like make that sound like, a lot of pressure on Sarah, but I just love how she writes setting. And I'm really excited because she's put together a whole bunch of excerpts from her writing, which is exciting because you get to see a lot of my writing on my channel. I share a lot of it, or I share my publications with you, but we don't get to see Sarah's writing all that much. So it's going to be a bit of a treat to go through her work. But
Thank you.
yes, so basically, now we're going to get into the how-tos behind it. Like Sarah said, no one's really a pro here in terms of like, this is the perfect way to establish atmosphere. It's just sort of like a way to think about atmosphere. So she first started to mention atmosphere as language. Language as being a big part of establishing atmosphere. If you want to kind of get into the point and then I can kind of riff off you.
Sure. So we were kind of discussing that when you're trying to craft a certain atmosphere, the words you choose play a big part in that. And a lot of that has to do with, specifically choosing, carefully choosing words to fit in your descriptions. And Rachel had made this great sort of image of placing a magnifying glass on certain details that are important to the feeling you want to create. And so I noted you could have a whimsical, candied world versus a gloomy one. And the language you use in that sort of reflects that tone that you're going for. So you can use bright, maybe short words to create an atmosphere that is, very candy coated, versus a gloomier one. You might want to emphasize some grittier language, maybe some sinister language, depending on what sort of vibe you're trying to build.
Yeah, and atmosphere is so interesting because I feel like it's such like a broad thing in a story. It is like all encompassing atmosphere, but like you can really establish it through the little tiny details. So it's kind of
Hmm.
interesting how that one big like amorphous part of a story, which is like the feeling of a setting, could be like created through tiny little, things that the character notices as parts of the setting. So, yeah, I love how Sarah described, whimsical candied world. Very beautiful. Just in the script alone, we're
Thank
creating
you.
atmosphere. And then you also talked about choosing language reflective of the tone you're trying to establish. And I think this is such a big one, especially for writers who are like trying to experiment with word choice and trying to be a little bit more creative. I know that when I was doing that, I mean, it's always good to experiment. I think the best way to learn is to experiment. So, you know, go forth and like choose your kind of weird tonally words for the scene that you're trying to establish. It's always good to sort of experiment, and if it works, it works, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. But when I was like getting into like learning more about word choice, I remember picking some like bizarre words that might not have like done what I wanted them to, and the experiments
Yeah.
were helpful. But Sarah, if you kind of want to talk about maybe how you feel about that, choosing language reflective of the tone or atmosphere you're trying to create.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of a fine line here in terms of using contrasting language to make a point or, things like that. But I think what I meant by this point of choosing language reflective of the tone you're trying to establish was, when you're writing a paragraph that's meant to feel maybe, I don't know, dreamy or something like that, you wouldn't necessarily want to use a word or create an image that feels jargony or maybe overly formal or using a scientific image. I mean, there's probably cases where that would work, but just to really boil it down is when you're trying to create a certain vibe, you might not necessarily want to interrupt that mood that's being built with language that sort of doesn't feel right. And a lot of that comes down to intuition and practice, which might not be the most helpful thing. But this is just sort of what I've learned. And when I reread some of my old work, I can sort of feel, oh, that image doesn't really fit in the tone I'm trying to establish here or the atmosphere of this scene. It feels like it doesn't, it didn't really mean to be there. And a lot of the times actually when I'm drafting, I'll get that feeling of, oh, I like this. This is a really nice description, but it doesn't feel like it needs to be here. And then I'll keep it there and then I'll come back and be like, oh, actually, I think I was right, instinctively. So, anyways, I don't know, Rachel, if you have more thoughts on
Yeah,
that.
I think it's always so interesting when you do those little experiments and then you're like, while I'm writing, I'm like, I don't think that's gonna work, but like I like it, so I'm just gonna leave it. That happens a
Yeah.
lot to me, especially like when I switch between character voices and
Yeah.
like tiny little remnants of the previous character's voice starts leaking through into the new one. I'm like, this does not work here, but like it's a good line. So sometimes I'll try to sneak them in, but oftentimes they really stick out, especially when it's like it's a different voice. Um, but I do think like the best way to learn how to pick the words, that you choose when trying to establish an atmosphere is like to almost like go in the opposite direction. Like if you like purposefully choose something that's so like outlandish for what you're trying to write, it might be easier that way to sort of illustrate the point, right? Like if you're like, oh, I would never write that because it doesn't make any sense. Well, then you can kind of better understand, or it doesn't make sense for the tone I was trying to establish. Then you can better understand why sometimes sticking to like a language environment, for example, which is a phrase that I should talk about more on my channel. I meant to make a whole thing about it. One day, maybe we can talk about
Yeah.
language environments. Can create a little bit more consistency. But yeah, and then we had some examples that you so nicely put together. And the first one that you had was a feeling of curiosity that doesn't quite fall into the nosy category. I don't know if you want to kind of introduce it yourself since this is your writing.
Yeah. So this is an excerpt from my book, and just context so you understand a little bit. It's of my protagonist happening upon a room that is empty, or there's no person in the room, and she is sort of going through their things.
Right.
And so it's an introduction to a new place that she hasn't been.
So again, the sort of atmosphere that Sarah's trying to go for here is a feeling of curiosity that doesn't quite fall into the nosy category. And I don't know if you want to read the excerpt yourself.
Okay, I'll try.
Yeah, you can read it, and then maybe I can read the next one.
Okay, sure. Okay. My shoulders fell. No one was inside, a bed half rumpled, a pair of all-black sneakers kicked off to the side. Knickknacks and books lined the walls, the concrete barely peeking through. Drawings pinned up, 2 album cover slips unfolded and hanging, creases still intact, one of a glassy beetle on a black background, the other a single vial of blood. I raked through the leaves of paper scattered on the desk to my left. A pen drawing of a heron, a river, a foal, and its mother drinking from it. A few pages that just said deer, another with buildings etched onto it, a pizza parlor in a market square. The room smelled intensely of wood, from a candle I realized on the end of the desk. It wasn't burning, an inch of wax left in the jar, a couple matches broken on a textbook called A History of Billiards. I clucked out a laugh.
Ooh, I love it.
Thank you.
I love this book. I know that's not what we're talking about, but I just love it. It's so good. It's good to hear you read your writing. We haven't read our writing to each other in a long time.
No, not out loud.
No. And so you started with your notes about talking about sort of the curiosity in the atmosphere. What did you think about it? Just want to hear your like initial debrief.
Sure. Like what I was trying to build here was, when you're curious about things, you're sort of taking in things rapidly when you enter a new place and like, oh, there's this over here and over here and over here. And so I tried to do that by listing descriptions sort of in rapid succession. Like, I don't know, like the books on the walls and the drawings pinned up and the album covers and just sort of listing those over and over again. But I didn't add any reflection of, oh, why would someone hang that up on a wall? Or, oh, they, are so messy or something like that. I didn't add that because I wanted to keep this sort of light curiosity in the voice and in the setting around as she's sort of exploring. So I didn't want too much judgment there. And there's a bit of a busyness in the atmosphere, but not busy in like a kind of very closed in way, but busy in a, oh, wow, this is like just interesting to comb through. It's kind of like when you go to an awesome like thrift store or something and there's just so much around you and you're just excited a little bit to rake through it all. And then I thought the laugh at the end grounded the setting as one that might feel relatable because, there's just this random book on a random topic that's just strewn around in a rather busy space. which I don't know. I relate to having that, just sort of like random objects that don't necessarily make sense in an environment. And so I think that just paired off nicely this setting description of just kind of looking through something just for fun and just being very curious about what you'll find next.
Right. I think that's what I got out of it. Like, just from, I love that what you said about the busyness and sort of like the quick succession, the rapid fire details. I think it really does create the, like something is like happening. Like I'm like unraveling my sort of like lack of knowledge of this person. And now I can kind of see them. Like I can see them sort of coming into their space, at least coming into focus. I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
And so cool how you could just do that through like the sentence structure and how you like choose to show the details rather than like kind of peppering them throughout like other narrative or like, reflection or whatever. So yeah, and then you had it like without the same atmosphere and like without in like quotation marks, because I think we were talking about this earlier, how like atmosphere is kind of like one of those things that's just there, like even in stories where like you're not trying to create atmosphere, I feel like it would be really hard to write something like a zero atmosphere.
I agree.
Like, yeah, I feel like atmosphere is just there kind of intrinsically. Anyways, so that's sort of my thought.
Well, it sort of hovers over every single word that could ever exist. So
right. And so you removed, quote unquote, the atmosphere if you want to read that version.
yeah, and it's just sort of a different sort of sense that one might get after reading. Okay. My shoulders fell. The bed was unmade, the room messy. Each wall was cluttered with knickknacks and drawings. I looked through the papers on the desk to my left, various nature sketches and unfinished letters. The room smelled like wood from a candle on the end of the desk. A couple broken matches were left on a textbook called A History of Billiards. I laughed.
Yeah. Like, I think the atmosphere is, is there. It just feels like it's just dampened down a lot. Like,
Yeah.
it's not, I don't know, it's not like sparkly anymore. There's like less of like a voice to it. It's interesting how like all these elements of writing start to converge, like atmosphere.
They're all called different things, but they're
right. They're all like, they all
Sort of.
do the same thing, really. Like, because the
Yeah.
atmosphere lends into the voice, which lends into the tone, which like, like it all sort of cycles into one thing at the end of the day. So I think that's interesting how it also then lacks the description. It lacks a bit more voice without that sort of same level of atmosphere. So I hope that like more clearly illustrates what we're saying about atmosphere and like detail placement and things like that. And then we had this other example where it's atmosphere and reflection and a sharp turn into a different atmosphere via one sentence, which I think is so cool. This is actually also written by Sarah. I don't mind reading it because you read the last one. And also
Okay.
these are my characters, because this was
Yes.
from a book that Sarah and I were co-writing, which was one of the topics, by the way. It was doing very well in the poll, and then this one I think pulled through. And
Yes, but it's kind of 2 in 1.
yeah, exactly. So we have a little bit of reading from the book. Sarah completely wrote this. I did not write any of it. And yes, so
Maybe you did.
I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, no. Besides coming up with the character names like 10 years ago.
Yes,
And
well,
not
that counts.
So okay, so this is the paragraph from Of the Red Earth, which is the title of that book. Okay. Harrison was everything I admired about Christiane, everything I wanted for myself. He had her guts, and though I hated to admit it, her charm. They were friendly and unfriendly in all the same ways, wore their curls brushed so the ends would flare in the sun like dandelion fluff. They both answered as though they hadn't heard the question asked, were both evasive, though I suppose I was too. I barely knew Christiane outside of who I was with her. Harrison couldn't even look at the photographs of his mother, yet he carried around her possessions. Maybe they were good luck charms. Maybe it felt like he was carrying around bones. Oh, now I see what the sharp turn into a different atmosphere via one sentence was.
Yes.
We found the one sentence.
Yes, well, that was my sort of goal with this example, was showing how you can set this sort of nostalgic light feeling at first, which was in, comparing Harrison to Christiane and delving into memory and, this sort of feeling of safety. And then, I use this image of dandelion fluff, which is quite literally light, airy fluff. And so that is sort of quite literally working its way into the atmosphere. But then when we get to the last sentence, there's a bit of a turn into this image that feels more gruesome in relation to dandelion fluff. And so you can definitely create that contrast. And I like to do that when I want to create impact. So that's either, the final sentence in a chapter, maybe in a novel. I don't know. But that's definitely, I end a lot of scenes and chapters by doing this sort of,
Right.
Setting one mood and then shifting quickly to another.
I call that, I think I have a video on it if you can find it. I think it's my favorite writing techniques too on my channel. I think I included this one. The literary punch, I think is what I called it.
Oh, wow.
Which is what it sounds like. Like it's like a kind of a twist almost, like a literary cliffhanger almost. Not like a cliffhanger in the natural sense of like the plot, but in the sense of the unresolved like tension in the reader that makes them want to like keep reading. Like 'cause
Yeah.
the turn in the switch in that sentence is just kind of addictive. You want to keep reading. So I love that excerpt, obviously. I mean, the last two sentences. So the turn, if you missed it when I first read it, was, maybe they were good luck charms. Maybe it felt like he was carrying around bones. So what Sarah said about the narrator here, who is Reeve, if anyone is actually familiar with my writing and my characters, she's like thinking about her childhood with her sister, who in this paragraph is named Christiane. And so she's thinking of through, of her childhood through like a very nostalgic lens. And then like the end, like it quite is like a stake in that feeling of, glittery golden almost nostalgia. And it's like maybe him carrying around these nostalgic artifacts of his own childhood doesn't feel like nostalgia to him, but feels like, carrying around like a dead sort of weight. So that was good. It's also good at bringing us into like the next mood of like how she can kind of continue to establish, I don't know, maybe Harrison's personality, kind of his own issues.
What I liked about this example was that it was atmosphere that's established more in reflection. There's not really a setting that, a character's not walking into a place. But the thing is, like, if you're writing a novel, even, when you're writing a short story, for example, too, the whole thing isn't just descriptions of settings. And so I wanted to use this one to show how an atmosphere, a mood can actually be established in more reflective sentences and, sort of using certain imagery within that reflection to set that mood and to create that feeling of, oh, at first this is nostalgic and then it's kind of sad at the end.
Yeah. Okay, so now to get back into the paragraph, but without that same atmosphere, I'll read it and we can kind of discuss the difference. So this is that paragraph. Harrison was everything I liked about Christiane. He was confident like her and was charming too. They were both friendly and unfriendly, wore their curly hair brushed and pushed back. They both answered as though they hadn't heard the question asked, were both evasive, though I was like that too. I barely knew Christiane outside of who I was with her. Harrison couldn't even look at the photographs of his mother, but still carried her things because he loved her and, maybe worse, missed her. I mean, I think it's still good, but there's a clear difference to me. I think, like, the first one, yes, there's that, like, sweeping almost nostalgia, and this one's just kind of like, yeah, we're getting the information, but there's less of that, golden kind of like, ooh, childhood, like she was having a good time back then and now her life is hard. But yeah, and then also like that last line with Harrison couldn't look at the photographs of his mother but still carried her things because he loved her and maybe worse missed her. Like, it doesn't hit like maybe they were good luck charms, maybe it felt like he was carrying around bones. Like, it's so much better.
Well, that's why I kind of said atmosphere can help that the setting or the writing sparkle. It's not that this doesn't work. I actually kind of like it.
No, it's not bad. I like it too.
But it just shows you it's sort of when you focus on a certain kind of atmosphere, what can happen to the
Right. And
writing.
we were also talking about style too. And I feel like atmosphere and the way you write atmosphere can also affect your style. So it's so interesting. I
Yeah.
mean, like all of these parts of writing, writing isn't just like a charm bracelet where you can put one charm on and you're like, yay, like it's the whole
Mhm.
bracelet. Like it's not just
Mhm.
one charm at a time. You're gonna want to use all of every single technique that you're gonna use in writing or whatever. All elements of writing sort of come together to create this overall picture. But anyways, then the next example is Sarah has put it as sleepover slash sense of safety, even though an uncertain slash scary atmosphere looms in the distance. I love that you called it sleepover. That has a very distinct vibe to it. So this is yours. You can read it.
Sure, this is from my other novel, that has the same characters, but this is a literary fiction version of it. Okay. Oliver lay on the sofa bed with a can of apricots balanced on his knee. A film of blue light had glossed his face and tinted his green eyes aquamarine. He still wore his jeans, and I still wore my dress, neither of us willing to venture into the hallway's dark mouth to retrieve our pajamas. We covered with old knitted throws Gale had made, the fibers still baked with dust, their hems grazing the floor.
Ooh. I love this because I think exactly I don't know how you even came up with this on the script. Like you're so smart. Like the sense of kind of dread like behind this like ooh sleepover, vibe. We have like,
Mm-hmm.
Oliver's on the sofa bed. He's just chilling with his can of apricots, which is such a brother thing. Like what's with brothers that we write with in citrus? Like brothers and citrus in our books go ahead. Like it's Oliver and his apricots and like Lonan and his like, clementines. Like they're I don't know. We need to like look into that. Anyways, that sort of is a sweet image. He almost is like a cat, like kind of on the sofa
Mm-hmm.
bed with his fruit. And I love this. A film of blue light had glossed his face. That really like kind of tucks me in. It's also a little unsettling because blue light, I'm like, ooh. Like if it was yellow light,
Yeah.
it would feel like ah. But like the blue light's like, hmm. But also like it's a film of it, so clearly he's being encased by it in a sense, which is kind of cozy. Um,
Yeah. And I mean, like, the feeling of this would be different if I had written blue light slashed across his face, right? Versus a film of blue light had glossed his face. And that sort of goes into my note that I had written, which was that language, like, for example, in this excerpt I used film, glossed, aquamarine, baked, grazing, all have this whimsical or dreamy connotation to them in their literal meanings in some cases, but also in their sound. And maybe that's the poet in me. But I think the sound of a lot of words quite literally can connotate how one feels when they read that word. So the example I wrote was if you're wanting to write something dreamy, you could quite literally use a word that sounds dreamy. At least to me, this word sounds dreamy,
Yeah.
which is gauzy. And so you could capture that feeling in just that one word in its sound alone. Yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts on
Yeah,
that.
I mean, as poets, like that's like half of poetry to me. Like the sound of the word and how the sound creates something, a meaning, like a vibe, the atmosphere. So yeah, I think that's so
Hmm.
cool that you can create atmosphere through single words. And I think Sarah has like listed out really great examples, like with filmed, glossed, aquamarine, like all those words that can create their own atmosphere in themselves. Just a single word. How you can create atmosphere through single words too.
Yeah.
And then you had the version without the atmosphere as well.
Yeah, this one is significantly shorter. Okay. Oliver lay on the sofa bed with a can of apricots on his knee. The TV light shone over his face. He still wore his jeans, and I still wore my dress, both of us too afraid of the dark hallway to retrieve our pajamas. We covered in itchy blankets that grazed the floor. So it's not that there isn't a sense of atmosphere here, it's just the atmosphere I had wanted of that sleepover sense of safety with the sort of scary atmosphere in the
Yeah.
background. isn't really established in this.
Yeah, and I feel like this is how I can think about atmosphere too. Atmosphere is almost like a sense of reverb. Like it's kind of this echo that's there.
Yeah.
It's like haunting, and haunting not necessarily in a bad way, because you can have like positive atmosphere that's still like a bit of a haunting the narrative. It's just kind of like, yeah, this film over the narrative. Whereas like
Mm-hmm.
the excerpts without quote unquote atmosphere just kind of feel like they're like very crispy audio, kind of like the audio, hopefully,
Mm-hmm.
that you're listening to right now. Hopefully, Rachel can make it sound crispy.
Hopefully.
It's kind of just like, you're listening to it. It sounds nice, but it's more to the point. It might be a little easier
Yeah.
to read because it's a bit simpler. So
Yeah.
maybe I almost was thinking like
Yeah.
children's stories are kind of more written this way, like so.
That's true.
Yeah, a little simpler, a little bit more to the point, but it's lacking.
Well, maybe because illustrations might sort of quite literally show the
Oh my
atmosphere
god,
too.
yeah, you're right. That's exactly why.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that makes sense as to why that's kind of how I view it. This the reverb sense in the atmosphere versus the very crispy, kind of up
Yeah.
close, pared back version without quote unquote the
Yeah.
atmosphere. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why I like to describe it as like a coating, or it's this sort of veil
Yeah.
that's just sort of hanging over the writing. Which I know atmosphere is a very abstract concept. I, even after talking, in this whole conversation, barely understand what that word means. But
Yeah.
I at least hope that the information that we've sort of, given in this conversation kind of gives you a better idea of a little bit of what I mean by what atmosphere is and how one can achieve that.
Right. And we've spoken sort of on and off between the examples about like breaking the atmosphere, moments that can kind of pull you out. I do it a lot where, I have characters who are very, religiously motivated in their voices, right? And so sometimes when I'm not writing with characters like that, it'll be weird when like I start to use like, religious symbolism, and it pulls me out of the story because I'm like, that's not how it's supposed to feel. Like, why is it starting to
Mhm.
feel kind of misplaced? This sort of vibe of the story feels a little weird in this section. And you had mentioned it with your excerpt with, you could have written like a film of blue light, slashed his face, right? And tinted his green eyes aquamarine. And you could have continued to say like, and it looked like he was on a battlefield, before something bad was gonna happen. And that would have like been even weirder. Like, oh, that's really taking me out. Like, why is Oliver on a battlefield when he's previously lying on the sofa bed with a can of apricots balanced on his knee? So that's kind of an example of breaking the atmosphere a bit, and how oftentimes those are some of the little fine-tuned revisions that I make in a line edit, just sort of taking out the moments that break that veil. You want the feeling of atmosphere, unless you're trying to break the veil. Like for example, with the Harrison example with the bones.
Yeah, with the
That's a
bones.
perfect example
Mhm.
of puncturing the crap out of that atmosphere and doing it on purpose so that you can sort of shift gears, or call attention to something, really emphasize something in the draft. So that's just sort of like a little quick aside about kind of keeping consistent with atmosphere, as well as like kind of breaking atmosphere, how you can do it intentionally, why you might not want to do it, or how to avoid doing it when you don't want to do it, for example. But that was basically all we had on atmosphere, unless Sarah has anything else to add.
Well, no, that's sort of a muscle that develops over time. And so none of this is meant to be prescriptive.
Yeah, and it's more something that you should really figure out with experimentation. Like I think that's like one of our biggest things. Like I don't want people to like take my word like as advice and then just like keep doing it without trying things for yourself, because it's so important to like learn what works in your voice, because our voice is going to be so different. Because I'm sure there's a writer out there who can have such a consistent voice doing the most inconsistent things. And that's just because of
Yeah, exactly.
the way their like voice functions. So, if you're listening
Yeah.
to this, and especially like the younger writers, or, people who are just starting out in writing, like, I want to be going into each writing session being like, okay, so this is what the atmosphere is going to be. No, it's just more like allowing yourself to feel, like to steep in the atmosphere of your story. Let it develop around you. Let yourself develop it.
Yeah.
Let it change over time. You might have to go back and like adjust things or whatever. But like let the writing unfurl in front of you.
Yeah, that's a good point. And shout out to Ashley, our best friend. She came up with this great idea, which is kind of what I did here with the examples. But, maybe if you wanted to do something like this with your own writing, to take a paragraph of something that you've written and try to change the atmosphere, or make it maybe a creepy atmosphere, make it a very vibrant, candied atmosphere, like I said earlier, and see how that might change, or what language you might change to achieve that feeling. I just think that's a good idea, like tiny paragraphs at a time, not like a whole novel's worth. That's very overwhelming. I think a lot of the times for me, you're not going to be going and thinking of, oh, I'm going to write the atmosphere in my whole, like all these paragraphs. No, but I think it's easy if you're, let's say you have a character walking into a room and it's different from where they came before. It might be a good experiment or a fun experiment to try to see where one can play with the mood and that sort of veil that's hovering over all the language.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Ashley, I guess, for coming up with that.
Yes, it's all Ashley.
Well, if she's listening to that, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that really leads us to the end of this episode. Thanks so much for listening to us. And it's always great to have Sarah on the podcast. So make sure that you let us know what else you want to see. This is more of a craft-based episode, but we're also happy to do many other things. And of course, there was the whole poll. So we're going to get to all the ideas. Don't worry.
Yes.
So that's basically it from me. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. And I'll let Sarah sign off, and then that's it from us.
Yeah, I really hope that this episode was fun to listen to. I hope that it just sort of gave you some ideas. And I hope it was interesting to hear about all these different perspectives that we have and this sort of random ramble about craft. Like I said, it's not meant to be a prescriptive thing of like, you're not doing this correctly if you're doing this or this or this. It's just like our thoughts. We've been writing for 10 years and we just...
You end up with a lot of thoughts. Yeah, after 10 years, you end up with a lot of thoughts.
Yeah. And I'm sure as time passes on, more
of course,
more of those thoughts will
We'll
come.
see you in 10 years to talk about atmosphere again. Maybe we'll have more things to say. But anyways, that's it from us. Thanks so much for listening. Make sure that you, follow the podcast, like it, everything that you can do, whatever. I don't really know how this works on all the different platforms. You can find us on Spotify. You can find us on YouTube and hopefully everywhere else as soon as Rachel does it. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in episode 4, hopefully sometime soon. Okay, bye.
Bye.